For 70 years, there was one rule in North American energy that nobody questioned. Canadian oil goes south. It doesn't matter how much Alberta produces. It doesn't matter how the politics shift. It doesn't matter who sits in the White House or who sits in Ottawa. The oil goes south into American pipelines, into American refineries, onto American highways. That rule built entire cities. It built Calgary's skyline, and it built the refining belt along the U.S. Gulf Coast. It made the United States and Canada two economies stitched together by steel pipe, so tightly integrated that people stopped even thinking of it as trade. It was just plumbing. But right now, in the summer of 2026, that 70-year rule is breaking. Not with an explosion, not with a single dramatic announcement. It's breaking the way a dam breaks, slowly, then all at once. And the direction all that oil is starting to move is west, across the Pacific, into China. This is the story of how that happened, why it's accelerating right now, and why some of the most powerful people in Washington are starting to realize they may have lost more leverage than they think. Let's start with the number that should stop you in your tracks. As recently as 2023, China was buying about 7,000 barrels of Canadian crude oil per day through the export terminal in British Columbia. 7,000 barrels. That's a rounding error. That's less oil than a single mid-sized American refinery burns through in about half an hour. Today, China is buying more than 200,000 barrels a day from that same corridor. That's not an increase. That's not growth. That is a different universe. And in October of last year, ship tracking data showed something that would have sounded insane just 3 years earlier. In a single month, roughly 70% of all the oil tankers leaving the port of Vancouver were sailing for China. 70%, not 40, not 50. 70. So what changed? How did a country that was buying almost nothing from Canada suddenly become its most aggressive new customer? The answer starts with concrete and steel. For decades, Alberta's oil sands were landlocked. Alberta produces some of the largest oil reserves on the planet, more proven reserves than almost anywhere outside Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. But almost all of that oil had exactly one way out, pipelines running south into the United States. There was a pipeline that could, in theory, reach the Pacific coast. It was called Trans Mountain, but it was old, it was small, and it could barely move 300,000 barrels a day, most of which stayed close to home. Canada decided to fix that. The Canadian government actually bought the pipeline outright for $5.5 billion after the private company that owned it walked away from the project, spooked by regulatory delays and public opposition. Ottawa took it over specifically to make sure it got built. It took years. It took a pandemic. It took cost overruns that pushed the total price tag past $30 billion, nearly 7 times the original estimate. But in May of 2024, the expanded pipeline finally opened. Its capacity nearly tripled, from around 300,000 barrels a day to 890,000 barrels a day. For the first time in Canadian history, there was a real high-volume route for Alberta's oil to reach the ocean without touching American soil. And almost immediately, Asia started buying. Within the first month, the pipeline was already running at 81% of capacity. Within the first year, exports to what Canadian officials call the Indo-Pacific region, everywhere from China to South Korea to India, went from essentially zero to hundreds of millions of dollars a month. China became the single largest new buyer, almost overnight. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because this wasn't purely a Canadian success story. Timing mattered a lot. The expanded pipeline opened at almost exactly the same moment the United States and China were sliding into one of the ugliest trade conflicts in decades. Washington hit Chinese goods with new tariffs. Beijing hit back. Both sides escalated. And somewhere in the middle of that fight, Chinese refiners looked at a map and realized there was now a brand new source of heavy crude oil sitting right across the Pacific, flowing through a pipeline that had just tripled its capacity, owned by a country that wasn't at war with them over trade. China's purchases of American oil collapsed. At one point, Chinese imports of U.S. crude fell from around 29 million barrels a month to roughly 3 million barrels a month, a drop of almost 90%. At the very same time, Chinese purchases of Canadian crude through that new Pacific pipeline kept climbing. 7 million barrels in a single month at the terminal near Vancouver, then more the next month, then more again. Analysts at the University of Alberta's China Institute tracked the pipeline's exports to China, rising from about 25,000 barrels a day when it opened to more than 350,000 barrels a day within roughly a year. That is not a coincidence. That is a country deliberately rerouting its energy relationships in real time, using a tariff war as the excuse and a brand new pipeline as the tool. Statistics. Canada eventually put real numbers behind the shift. In the first full year the expanded pipeline operated, the United States still took the largest single share of crude moving out of British Columbia, just over half. But China had already climbed to nearly a third of everything moving through that corridor, a market share that used to belong almost entirely to American refiners. By late 2025, some monthly snapshots showed China's share of Pacific-bound Canadian crude climbing as high as 2/3 of total volume. Let that sink in for a second. The pipeline that Americans assumed would mostly serve the U.S. West Coast is now sending the majority of its oil to a strategic rival of the United States, and the dollar figures are climbing just as fast as the barrel counts. In 2025, crude oil and bitumen made up the majority of everything Canada shipped to China in the energy category, reaching close to 6.3 billion Canadian dollars, an increase of more than 155% from the year before. Then, in just the first 3 months of 2026, Canada's energy exports to China hit roughly 3.4 billion Canadian dollars, up 67% from the same quarter a year earlier. This isn't a blip. This is a trend line pointing almost straight up. And it's not happening by accident. It's happening because the government in Ottawa wants it to happen. Prime Minister Mark Carney has made trade diversification the centerpiece of his economic strategy since taking office. And he's been remarkably blunt about why. After Washington slapped tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, autos, and a long list of consumer goods, Carney concluded that Canada could no longer afford to have basically one customer for its most important export. Earlier this year, Carney traveled to Beijing to meet directly with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Out of that visit came a target that Canadian officials have repeated in almost every public statement since: grow exports to China by 50% by the year 2030. In May of 2026, China's top diplomat, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, made the first visit by a senior Chinese official to Ottawa in an entire decade. Sitting across from Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister, Anita Anand, Wang didn't just accept the 50% target, he raised it. He told the Canadian delegation that China could become the world's largest consumer market, and that it was, in his words, willing to open itself to Canada. He floated the idea of doubling Canadian exports to China by 2030, not just increasing them by half. Total trade between the two countries had already reached roughly 125 billion Canadian dollars the year before. Both governments are now openly talking about pushing that number dramatically higher, with energy sitting near the top of the agenda every single time. And China has been backing up the rhetoric with real concessions. In March of 2026, Beijing suspended a set of retaliatory tariffs it had placed on Canadian canola meal, peas, lobster, and crab. Tariffs that had been hammering Canadian farmers and fishers. China also slashed its tariff on Canadian canola seed from a combined rate of almost 85% down to under 15%, a change affecting roughly $4 billion a year in Canadian agricultural exports. Around the same time, Beijing reopened its market to beef from 20 registered Canadian meat processing facilities. None of that is charity. China is systematically removing friction from its economic relationship with Canada at the exact moment it wants more Canadian energy flowing its way. Agriculture concessions and energy imports are being negotiated as part of the same broader picture. Now, if you're sitting in Washington watching all of this, you might be tempted to shrug. The United States still buys the overwhelming majority of everything Canada exports. Nothing about this changes that today. And that's true. It's important to be honest about that. Canada is not walking away from the United States. The U.S. remains by far Canada's largest trading partner, and the vast majority of Canadian crude, somewhere around 90%, still flows south, the same way it always has. But here's the thing about leverage. It doesn't require someone to lose their biggest customer. It only requires them to gain a second one. Think about what negotiating looks like when you only have one buyer for your most important product. That buyer sets the terms. They can threaten tariffs, they can demand concessions, they can drag out negotiations for months because they know you have nowhere else to sell. Now think about what changes the moment you have a second serious buyer, willing to pay competitive prices, with the infrastructure in place to actually take the volume. Suddenly, you can say the two words that change every negotiation on Earth. Or else. Some Canadian officials have been remarkably candid that this is exactly the point. When Washington and Ottawa have clashed over tariffs, and they've clashed constantly since Donald Trump returned to office, Canadian producers now have a sentence available to them that simply didn't exist a few years ago. We have other customers. And this year, that sentence has been getting tested in real time. As of the last few days, literally as this video is being made, the United States and Canada are locked in another tense standoff over tariffs. Washington had threatened 50% tariffs on a wide range of Canadian goods, everything from wine to hockey sticks, set to take effect this weekend. President Trump delayed the deadline at the last minute, posting that the two sides were close to a deal, while negotiators from both countries scrambled to finalize terms in Washington. This has been the pattern for over a year now. Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods back in February of 2025, 25% on most imports, 10% specifically on energy products. Canada retaliated with tariffs of its own, first on $30 billion of American goods, then escalating to cover much more. Trade talks broke off entirely at one point after a dispute over an advertising campaign referencing Ronald Reagan. Trump added another 10% tariff on top of everything else in response. Then, this past February, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down several of Trump's emergency tariff powers entirely, ruling he'd overstepped his legal authority. Trump pivoted almost immediately to a new 10% global tariff structure. And now, in August, both sides are once again racing against a deadline, trying to strike a deal before another round of 50% tariffs kicks in. Here's the detail that matters most for this story. Even in the harshest rounds of these tariffs, oil, gas, and potash have consistently been left out. Washington needs Canadian energy too badly to tax it heavily. American refiners in the Midwest and Gulf Coast are built specifically to process the type of heavy crude that comes out of Alberta's oil sands. Light American shale oil doesn't work the same way in those refineries. Swapping suppliers isn't simple, but that's exactly why the Pacific pivot matters so much. Even with energy mostly exempted from the tariff fights, the broader relationship has been unstable enough, contentious enough, and unpredictable enough that Canada decided it could no longer bet its entire energy future on staying in Washington's good graces. Every time tariffs escalate on steel, aluminum, autos, or consumer goods, it reinforces the same lesson in Ottawa: diversify or stay vulnerable. There's also a pricing story hiding underneath all of this, and it's one that most viewers never hear about. But it explains why Alberta's oil industry is celebrating this shift so loudly. For decades, Canadian heavy crude has traded at a steep discount to the American benchmark price, largely because it was landlocked. Western Canadian Select, the country's main heavy oil price marker, has historically sold for significantly less per barrel than West Texas Intermediate, the U.S. Standard, simply because Canadian producers had nowhere else to sell it. When you only have one buyer, that buyer doesn't have to pay top dollar. They know you can't walk away. That discount has started shrinking. Analysts at RBC Capital Markets tracked barrels leaving the Westridge terminal in British Columbia selling at a noticeably smaller discount to West Texas Intermediate than similar Canadian barrels shipped out of the U.S. Gulf Coast. Their explanation was simple. Strong demand from Chinese buyers is lifting the price Canadian producers can command because now there's real competition for the same oil. That's the leverage argument playing out in dollars and cents in real time on every single tanker that leaves the coast. Now let's talk about the other side of this equation, because this story isn't only about Canada making a choice, it's also about China needing one. China is the largest crude oil importer on the planet, buying more foreign oil than any other country in the world by a wide margin. And 2026 has been an extraordinarily volatile year for the global oil market that China depends on. Earlier this year, the United States and Israel launched military strikes against Iran. Iran responded with missile and drone attacks against targets across the Gulf region, including areas near American military bases. The result was the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that normally carries roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil and fuel supply. For a country like China, which depends heavily on oil shipped from the Middle East through exactly that choke point, this was a five-alarm fire. But China had been preparing for something like this for over a year. Beijing had been quietly stockpiling crude oil at a rate of roughly 1 million barrels a day throughout 2025, buying up discounted supply from sanctioned producers like Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, while prices were still relatively low. By some estimates, China had built up close to 1 billion barrels of spare oil sitting in storage before the crisis even hit. When the Hormuz disruption came, China had a buffer that almost no other country on Earth had. Analysts credited that stockpile with helping prevent an even bigger spike in global oil prices, because China could simply draw down its reserves instead of scrambling to bid for scarce cargoes on the open market. China's overall crude imports actually fell sharply during the crisis, down as much as 40% year over year at one point, because refiners leaned on stored oil instead of buying at panic prices. So here's the important nuance in this story that a lot of headlines skip over. China isn't turning to Canada because it's desperate. China isn't turning to Canada because it has no other options. China has spent years building redundancy into its energy system, expanding its own domestic oil production, building new pipelines from Russia and Central Asia, accumulating enormous strategic reserves, and pushing electric vehicles hard enough that its demand for gasoline is actually starting to soften. China doesn't need Canadian oil to survive. But Canadian oil gives Beijing something almost as valuable as survival: options. Every barrel of Canadian crude flowing into Chinese refineries is a barrel that doesn't have to travel through the Strait of Hormuz, doesn't have to be shipped through the Strait of Malacca, the other massive choke point that carries roughly 80% of China's Middle Eastern oil imports, and doesn't carry the political risk attached to sanctioned Russian or Iranian barrels. Chinese analysts and officials have started referring to their reliance on the Malacca Strait as the Malacca Dilemma, the uncomfortable reality that so much of China's energy security runs through a single narrow waterway that a rival navy could theoretically choke off. Canadian oil, arriving straight across the North Pacific, sidesteps that dilemma entirely. It's faster to ship, it's more predictable, and it doesn't pass anywhere near a potential conflict zone. In global energy strategy, that kind of redundancy is priceless. China isn't just buying barrels of oil from Canada, it's buying insurance. And Canada is more than happy to sell it. Which brings us to where this story is actually heading, because everything we've talked about so far, the pipeline expansion, the surging exports, the trade diplomacy, is really just the opening chapter. The bigger story is what Canada is planning to build next. Prime Minister Carney has started using a specific phrase to describe his ambitions for the country, and it's not subtle: energy superpower. He's used it repeatedly in speeches and press conferences and meetings with provincial leaders, and he's backing it up with policy. In July of 2026, Carney stood alongside Alberta's Premier, Danielle Smith, and formally referred Alberta's proposal for a brand new West Coast oil pipeline to Canada's Major Projects Office. The fast-track approval body Carney's government created specifically to cut through the regulatory delays that have killed pipeline projects in the past. The proposed pipeline would run roughly along the existing Trans Mountain corridor and could eventually move up to 1 million barrels of oil per day toward Asia-bound tankers. That's more oil in a single new pipeline than the entire expanded Trans Mountain system carries today. Carney tied the announcement directly to a comment made by G7 leaders earlier this year in France, where the group's official statement specifically called out Canada's potential to deliver, in their words, significant additional energy capacity to global markets, explicitly framed around reducing the world's dependence on oil shipped through the Strait of Hormuz. Think about that for a second. The G7, the group that includes the United States, is on record encouraging Canada to build more export capacity to reduce global reliance on Middle Eastern choke points. And the most likely destination for a meaningful share of that new capacity is Asia, including China. This is bigger than one pipeline, though. According to an analysis published by Reuters this month, there are now at least 6 different pipeline projects underway or proposed across Canada. If every single one of them gets built, the country's total export pipeline capacity would grow by roughly 45%, an additional 2.25 million barrels per day by the year 2035. About half of that new capacity would still be aimed at the United States, including a proposal to revive elements of the old Keystone XL project that was canceled years ago. But the other half is aimed squarely at diversification: new Pacific capacity, new access to Asian buyers, new leverage. Now, Reuters was also careful to point out the catch. Filling all those new pipelines would require Canadian oil production to grow by more than a third within less than a decade, which is nearly double the country's current pace of growth. Major oil sands companies like Suncor and Canadian Natural Resources have both signaled recently that they're not rushing to commit to that kind of expansion. Enbridge even postponed part of its own pipeline expansion plans this summer after failing to secure enough customer commitments. So there's real uncertainty baked into Canada's most ambitious plans. Building the pipe is one thing. Filling it with enough oil to justify the cost is another. Not every barrel Carney wants to ship west is guaranteed to exist yet, and the politics inside Canada are messier than the headlines let on. British Columbia's Premier, David Eby, has pushed back hard against the new West Coast pipeline proposal, arguing his province was sidelined from the negotiations and raising environmental objections about tankers loading crude off the northern BC coast. Indigenous communities along the proposed route are still being consulted, and opposition politicians in Ottawa have accused Carney of moving too slowly, while environmental groups accuse him of moving too fast. None of that is unique to Canada. Big energy infrastructure fights everywhere. But it's a reminder that energy superpower is a slogan for now, not yet a finished pipeline. Still, the government has set real deadlines. Officials are targeting a formal listing decision under Canada's new fast-track infrastructure law by October of this year. And Carney has framed the whole effort as part of a wider push that's unlocking, in his own words, more than $200 billion in new energy and trade infrastructure investment across the country. It isn't only oil either. Canada has also been racing to build out liquefied natural gas export terminals on its west coast, aimed at exactly the same Asian buyers, Japan, South Korea, and increasingly China, who have spent years looking for LNG suppliers that aren't Russia and aren't subject to Middle East shipping risk. Every one of these projects points the same direction, away from a single continental market toward a global one. But the direction of travel is unmistakable. Every signal coming out of Ottawa points toward more westbound infrastructure, not less. Every recent trade negotiation with Beijing has featured energy near the top of the agenda. And every fresh round of tariff tension with Washington has reinforced Canada's argument internally that relying on a single customer is a strategic liability it can no longer afford. It's worth pausing here to notice how unusual this alignment actually is. China and Canada don't agree on much. Just days before Wang Yi's visit to Ottawa, a Canadian warship sailed through the Taiwan Strait, defying an explicit warning from Beijing that such transits would harm the relationship. China has, at various points over the past decade, detained Canadian citizens, restricted Canadian canola and seafood, and clashed with Ottawa over technology and telecom security. This is not a friendship built on shared values. It's a relationship built on complementary self-interest. China wants secure, diversified energy supply, and Canada wants a buyer that isn't Washington. Both sides are choosing to set aside serious disagreements because the economic logic on the energy file is simply too strong to ignore. That's often how the biggest shifts in global trade actually happen, not through alliances, but through two countries deciding their interests overlap just enough on just one issue to work together anyway. So let's zoom all the way out and ask the question that actually matters here. Is Canada dumping the United States for China? No. That headline, as dramatic as it sounds, is inaccurate. The United States remains Canada's largest trading partner by an enormous margin, and that isn't changing anytime soon. 90% of Canadian crude still flows south. American refineries are still built specifically to run on Alberta's heavy oil. That physical and economic relationship took decades to build. And it isn't getting dismantled in a couple of years, no matter how many new pipelines get approved. But the real question was never whether Canada would abandon America. The real question is, what happens to the balance of power once Canada stops needing America as its only major customer? Because a supplier with one buyer has almost no leverage. A supplier with two buyers, competing for the same barrels, suddenly has real leverage. And a supplier with buyers in the United States, China, South Korea, Japan, and India all bidding for the same oil has more leverage than it has had in the entire history of the Canadian energy industry. That is the shift happening right now in real time, whether Washington wants to admit it or not. Every barrel that leaves the Westridge Marine Terminal in British Columbia bound for a Chinese refinery is a small, quiet demonstration of a much bigger point. Canada now has a choice. It didn't always have one. For most of the last century, the geography of North America made the decision for it. Alberta's oil had one road out, and that road led to the United States. Now there are two roads. And the country that used to assume it would always get first pick of everything flowing down that first road is discovering that its northern neighbor has options it never had before. Washington isn't losing Canada. Not yet, and maybe not ever, at least not in any complete sense. But it is losing something it used to take for granted. The assumption that every extra barrel Alberta could produce would automatically end up in an American refinery, on American terms, at an American price. That assumption is gone, and once a supplier discovers it has leverage, it rarely gives that leverage back. China wanted energy security, and it found part of the answer sitting right across the Pacific. Canada wanted trade diversification, and it found a customer with nearly unlimited demand, and a government eager to remove trade barriers to get more of what Canada is selling. The United States wanted to assume the old rules would hold forever. They didn't. And as more pipelines get proposed, as more tankers leave the coast of British Columbia loaded with Alberta crude, as trade ministers from Ottawa and Beijing keep meeting to push that 50% target even higher, one thing becomes harder and harder to ignore. The age of Canadian energy flowing almost exclusively south is ending. What comes next is a country that finally gets to choose who it sells to, instead of having that decision made for it by geography and by history. And if there's one lesson in this entire story that applies far beyond oil, far beyond Canada, and far beyond this specific moment in geopolitics, it's this. The moment you give any supplier a second customer, you've permanently changed the negotiation. It doesn't matter if it's oil or lithium or semiconductors or wheat. The country or the company or the person who only has one buyer will always eventually get squeezed. The one with two buyers gets to set terms. Canada spent $30 billion in the better part of a decade building exactly that kind of leverage into a pipeline made of steel. China spent that same decade quietly building the storage capacity and the diversified supply chain to make sure it never has to depend entirely on any single source again. And the United States, for the first time in generations, is being forced to negotiate with a neighbor that finally has somewhere else to go. That's not the end of the U.S.-Canada relationship. It's the end of an era where Washington never had to think about it at all.